Okay,
So
good
this
morning.
is
We're here
not a,
for,
yeah, go ahead.
I said good morning. We're going to start our discussion of the Master and His Emissary. And I did not get all the way through the book. I read the first part of chapter 1, but I'd be interested in what thoughts you guys have on the book.
Yeah. Shall I jump in, or does anybody else want to first? Okay, well, I have been very attracted to this book for a while, and so I was very glad to get it in audio format. And I find it intriguing because it seems to be a kind of proof of concept for a left versus right brain functionality, the way they work. You know, we've had this old idea that has been debunked, that the right brain is the artistic emotional side and the left brain is the analytical logical side. That's been debunked, except that there's a sense in which it hasn't. It's not that it's like the left and right hemispheres are involved in everything we do, but they do seem to have their specialities, which has to do with the way that it processes information. The left brain, I guess I'm going to be using my own language here a little bit, but the left brain kind of focuses down and drills down to specifics. It's trying to grasp meaning and understanding, and the language seems to be centered in that area because, as he says in later chapters, the left brain appears to be or language appears to have developed out of this idea that we're grasping and we're even gesturing as, you know, pre-humans, that it was almost like I'm sorry, I'm horrible at this, but the part of the brain that does language processing and the part that does language processing and the part that does gesturing with your hands when you're speaking, those two are like right next to each other. And so the theory is that one grew out of the other. On the other hand, the right brain kind of gives a whole view of everything. It's holistic, it's gestalt. It is attempting to unify everything. So rather than trying to grasp something, it's trying to take everything in. And one of the primary premises of the book is that our society has become so enamored by the processes of the left brain, which involves certainty, which involves grasping, that we have lost a lot of our connection with the right hemisphere, which sees things interconnectedly and globally. And that this is showing up in a lot of different ways. He'll get into in later chapters the specific ways that we can see this pattern emerging in in various societal institutions, where we are more interested in having a very narrow view that we can be certain of, rather than having a broad view that is organic and dynamic and moves around. We're not comfortable with that anymore, because we've decided that the certainty of the left brain, as it helps us process scientific data and get to certainty, we've decided that that's more comfortable for us, and that's more trustworthy. Whereas in actuality, when they test how smart the left brain is versus the right brain, it's actually the right brain that enables wisdom and understanding more than the left brain. The left brain can actually get very blind. So Ian talks about various tests where they've tested what happens when there's right brain lesions in someone, and those right brain lesions mean that the right brain isn't working as well. So the left brain is doing most of the work. And in those cases, some people will actually, if they have, the left side of their body is not working because of the right brain lesions, they will actually dismiss that side of their body and act like it doesn't even exist, because the left brain is not getting any feedback from the right brain. and the left brain is only interested in its very narrow view. So they'll have theories like, well, that's the arm of the person in the bed next to me. Or in one case, he talks about, well, that's my mother's arm. See how warm it is? That my mom's arm was very warm and very strong. Strange things like that. And it makes sense to the person because their right brain isn't given the global picture and going, no, that's us. That's also us. And on the other hand, or in another sense, when they do IQ tests for somebody who has right brain lesions, there's very little difference in their IQ testing scores. Whereas if they have left brain lesions, if they have left brain lesions, there's very little difference in their testing scores. If they have right brain lesions, their test scores are much, much lower. So it appears to be the case that, to summarize, that the left brain is about drilling down to a simple, abstract model of reality that it can then feel certain of and be like, this is what's true. Whereas the right brain is about global scope, complexity, and uncertainty. In fact, there's the emotion that is most associated with the right brain is sadness and kind of melancholy and these kind of things because it's not certain. That side of the brain is not certain about things, and it's just it's a state of this kind of overwhelmingness, but it's also a state of creativity where the mind becomes so open to new experiences that it is able to innovate new experiences, whereas the left brain is not as capable of that. Yeah. I've talked a long time.
I think of the four of us, you're the one who has successfully read the book more. I wasn't actually able to get a copy of the book. So I spent the time instead listening to Ian McGilchrist lectures on the book. So you summarized it well.
Good.
I found it somewhat unsatisfying. One of his quotes is, "Nothing makes sense in human psychology unless you accept in the light of brain lateralization." I thought, okay, but in all of these descriptions of brain lateralization, I'm not hearing any actual solutions or ways to apply the information. Just ways in which I can categorize very left brain the differences between the left and the right brain. But what am I going to do with that? Should I practice engaging the part of my brain that is that I might think that, let's see, this skill is something the right brain does, or this skill is something the left brain does. Should I try to develop that skill? Well, that just says, here's a list of skills, and things you're weak on, go practice that. If it's more than that, I want to know.
Okay.
If it's just that, okay.
Well, don't these differences show up when cases where there are lesions or disorders, and most of the time the left brain and the right brain are working in concert? I mean, there's massive amount of connections between the two. So to say, well, I'm just going to engage my right brain, or I'm just going to engage my left brain, we're using both halves all the time.
Well, I think what he specifically speaks about is that most of the interconnectivity between the hemispheres is actually about restricting function, so that the left brain will be like, okay, I've got this, right brain, shut down, please. That kind of thing. That's one of the upshots of it. So to me, one of the big takeaways is to realize that so a friend of mine calls it zoom in and zoom out. You zoom in, that's kind of a left brain function. You zoom out, that's a right brain function. And it's important to note that while the right brain, your zoom out, is aware of the zoom in function, the zoom in function appears to be unaware of the zoom out function. It doesn't seem to be like, oh, wait, we need to step back. The zoom in function doesn't think that way. It literally doesn't think that way. So we have to be able to kind of hit the cognitive awareness button and be like, okay, let's stop, let's step back, and let's see what the big picture is. So I think that's part of the big takeaway, because I think one of his arguments is that this is causing the assumption that the zoom in function is superior to the zoom out function has kind of possessed a lot of the mechanisms in our society, I think would be his argument, or something like that. And so I agree. There's not a whole lot of application in the book. I think he's more trying to build his argument as academically as he can without overstating what he can claim to be true academically. So, you could say let's experiment with it. Like that's kind of what I try to do. I'm doing the non-academic, non-credible thing of saying, okay, what crazy things can I do with this model that I might find useful? Whereas the scientists will have to take the theories, build a hypothesis, and then go to go to a study and test it.
It seems
like I need both.
He's swinging the pendulum the other way, trying to defend the right hemisphere against what he sees as a common notion that it's the weaker hemisphere, it's, not as capable as the left, and, it's just a coprocessor of sorts. Maybe he swings the pendulum too far, in glorifying right hemisphere activity over left hemisphere activity. But it just seems that he's trying to counteract this perception. And he mentioned a quote by Michael Gazzaniga. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. And I'm going to look and see if I can find that in the book. And if I do, I'll quote it.
Yeah, I usually, with our other book reviews, I had a PDF I could read along, and I couldn't find anything like. Well, honestly, I just didn't buy the book on PDF. I should have, but so
that's the other thing I didn't do.
Okay, I found the quote. It's from chapter 3. And the author is talking about how the right hemisphere had been thought by many to be inferior to the left. Michael Gazzaniga once wrote that it could well be argued that the cognitive skills of a normal, disconnected right hemisphere without language are vastly inferior to the cognitive skills of a chimpanzee.
So the left brain is, by itself, is somehow just about equivalent to the holistic brain processes of a chimpanzee. Is that what he's saying? Or did I misunderstand?
Let's see, there again, another quote from Michael Gazzaniga. The left hemisphere has many more mental capacities than the right one. The right hemisphere is a distant second with problem-solving skills. It knows precious little about a lot of things.
Okay, so that's a quote he's trying to overturn.
Right.
Okay.
Okay, good. So in the book, he said it's 680 pages and 2,500 references. I'm assuming those. I want to give him every credit that he has good reasons to think what he's telling me. Um, in the lectures that I pulled in, I didn't see him giving any reasons to think that these things were true, except in the cases of I'm thinking it was split brain patients, or maybe there was another way that they were able to suppress one side of the brain by like magnetic interference or whatever. And other than diagnosing brain lesions, what can I use this for? Is this, wow, I've met somebody who's very black and white thinking. Maybe they're stuck in their left brain. Well, that just gives me another label for they're in black and white thinking. And other than giving them examples and practicing with them areas where the gradient applies, what else could I address? Unless I'm doing medical therapy, which is not my gig.
If you smack him upside the head, you'll know which side to smack him upside by.
I look at it a little differently. For me, there doesn't have to be any practical use to it. It's more of, we see this asymmetry here. What does it mean in terms of how we think? And, that's interesting. And how does the brain work? What does it tell us about how the brain works? So for me, it's more curiosity driven. I don't need a practical application of it.
The left brain is taking over, especially in the West. That's part of, I think, the area in the first 3 chapters that we're covering, at least based on this summary. And that almost seems like, and there's something to do about it. And if we were to focus differently, we would get a different result. We could get a better result. Those kinds of questions. And does the book, well, if we haven't gotten through the book, I couldn't ask the full question, but is there anything in there that I'm missing where he says, and do this, or here's a way to approach people that will get a different result, or anything like that? I'm probably being very left brain. I want a practical solution here.
I think that I don't think he's there yet, honestly. I think interestingly enough, or ironically perhaps, he is using a very right brain process to form these opinions based off all the data, because he didn't do an experiment and kind of come up with a theory and a hypothesis based off of that one experiment, or he didn't build a hypothesis first and then go and test it. He grabbed all the data. He's done tons of research. I mean, the book has study after study after study after study that you go through. And I think you listed the primary ways. There's legions, there's separations between the hemispheres, and then there is chemical ways they can turn one side off and then the other, and test people with that. Those seem to be the 3 ways that he tests things. So, or not he, the way scientists have for a long time. And so he is looking at all that data, and rather than grasping onto a theory first to try to interpret all that, which is the left brain hemisphere's methodology, he's using the right brain to look at it all and then kind of innovate a way in which all these things put together. And I mean, he could be wrong, but it seems to, the reason I latch on to this book so much, and I love this book so much, is because it seems true of my personal experiences of the way my hemispheres work together. I don't know if this is a personality thing or if it's from my experiences as when studying art, but I try really hard to observe things, and I've tried to observe the way I think. And I definitely find that there are, this kind of zoom into certainty mode that I get in, and then there's this looser, less grasping mode I get in, and it is in that mode that my innovations come. But I also see the way the 2 work together. There's some other books on flow state that I've picked up a few times, and although it doesn't get into the books I read at least didn't get into any brain state studies, the the gist of Ian's work seems to overlap onto it, just like Ian's work seems to overlap on John Vervaeke's work on his Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series. And in fact, there's a fantastic conversation between those two. Actually, Vervaeke would be the guy to go to if you want application, because again, I think Ian's work maps onto John's work, and John is all about the applicability of, okay, we have these issues, now what do we do? What are our solutions? What are our practices? And he's actually trying to evolve what he calls a religion that is not a religion. And I don't know, his language is amazing. Like, if you can learn the language set that he's been developing to describe these things, it lets you zoom out on the human condition from a psychological point of view and from a meaning point of view in a very effective way, I think.
When he's talking about differences between left hemisphere and right hemisphere, at least the most visible anatomical differences, I think, are the right hemisphere is larger in the frontal area. Is that right? And the left hemisphere is larger in the back.
I'm trying to remember. I was thinking it was the opposite, but I could be wrong. But yeah, he describes it as it looks as if somebody grabbed the brain and kind of twisted it because of the way it's larger in the back and the front. I think that's the biggest point he makes about the way it looks. But then he does point to the fact that one interesting thing I thought was interesting was that even in a left-handed person, the left hemisphere is still controlling the grasp processing dynamic that's happening with the left hand. So it's not even, we've had this idea, and there is truth to it, that the left brain dominates the way the right hand functions. The eyes, it's not left brain uses one eye and right brain uses the other. It's split. There's the left quadrant, or the left half of both eyes, and the right half of both eyes are controlled by, or are processed primarily by the different hemispheres. He talks about, I might be digressing a little bit, but he talks about how in birds, if they're looking at you with their left eye, you know that they are doing relationship assessment. Is this somebody I trust? Is this something I should be afraid of? Is this a mate? Is this a friend, a foe? But if they're looking at you with their right eye, then they are assessing what they can grasp. Is that food? Is that, a tool? Is that, in the case of a crow, that might use a tool to get food. So I thought that was interesting, that the eyes are actually used differently in various animals based off what hemisphere they're using.
So I tried reading with my left eye closed and reading with my right eye closed. And, this isn't scientific, but I didn't notice any real difference in the experience of doing that. And I wonder whether a lot of these lateralization studies, because they're looking for differences, that's going to be magnified, whereas most of what is in the left hemisphere, the right hemisphere is very similar. Mm-hmm. The similarities dwarf the differences.
I think that's largely true. But like I said, it's not actually that the left eye and the right eye are being processed by the left and right hemisphere. It's that both eyes are being processed by both hemispheres, but it's a lateralization in the eye, so that each eye, in humans at least, in birds it's different. In horses, I think he mentions any animals that have eyes on either side of the head, then each eye is dominated by the other hemisphere. But in humans, it's divided down the middle. And how they can test that is they can have a film being played, or they can have a headgear on a person, and they can flash something super quickly in one side of the eye versus the other, and so quickly that you can't turn your eye and look and see it with both sides, both lateralizations of the eye, and then they can test and say, what did you see? Or can you draw something? Or what do you think you saw? Or what is your impressions? And they can discover that, like a person with hemisphere lesions or with where they've dampened down the effect on one side of the hemisphere, they can show that that a individual will have only seen with that side of the brain. So, for instance, the left hemisphere processes language. So, if they ask what was on the left side of the eye, the right brain won't have words for it and won't know. But if they flash it on the right side, then the left eye will be able to describe it. Ooh, what do we got there?
I see. So it's not left eye or right eye; it's left visual field versus
visual
right
field.
visual
Yes,
field, and I forgot that. So that makes sense.
What was that juggling lesson?
From Wikipedia, the diagram showing the paths of the optic nerves as mixing together, and anyway, it's just the schematic path of what you were describing.
Okay, nice.
So for those of us who are not split brain patients, we seem to have one integrated self, an awareness of things. If there is, another person inside my head having separate experiences, I'm certainly not aware of that.
Well, I mean, have you studied any Jung by chance?
No.
Or done some psychological work? Okay.
No.
I had to wave at my daughter sticking her head in the garage. Anyway, the idea there, and there's actually another book. I wish I could. I always forget the name. It's called something like Integrating Personal Family Dynamics or something like that. And that's probably not the title at all. But it's this idea that the psychologist had discovered that he could ask a patient to talk to various emotional parts of itself, various reactive parts of itself. And they could name that, and they could say, like, okay, you're the, let's talk to that part of you that gets so angry when this happens and blows up and starts violence. And that part will actually, you can actually ask that part of yourself questions and it will respond. And so I do think there's, I wouldn't say that I think there are different whole people running around inside the brain, because that would be a kind of an infinite regress situation. It's like, okay, so is there a brain inside of that little person that has a brain inside of that little person that has a brain? It's not that. It's more that we have a capacity to not exactly anthropomorphize our thoughts, but something like that. Like the part of our brain that turns the data we get from other people into someone we feel like we are relating to, and not just data. This part of our brain that allows us to see people and see people as people and react to people as people and anticipate what that person will say can be used to anticipate what other people will, what parts of the brain will be saying. And in much the same way, I think the hemispheres themselves have personalities. Like I think you can experiment with this idea of, well, what, and maybe it takes a little bit of practice and meditation, but you can begin to say, what will the zoom in function say? The certain function, the part of me that wants to complete a project, what will it say? And then, well, what will the part of me say that wants to zoom out and wants to see how everything integrates together? And it lets go of all the goal orientation and just experiences everything. I think there's some truth to be said that those are, in a sense, different parts of our personality, or different sides to us, or even, in a sense, different personalities.
Well, that's very interesting. I certainly don't experience myself as being fragmented in any way. I think there's a logical possibility that you could have two sentient persons inside of one head. Certainly you can have a body with two heads, and the two heads are two separate persons. Is that what's going on with split brain patients? Is that creating a separate consciousness in each side? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think we do know. I think he's definitely said that there's evidence that when there's split brain situations, that there really does seem to be different personalities that kind of jump in and control when those different parts of a person are activated. However, I wouldn't say, again, I don't think it's that we have different separate personalities jumping around. I think it all integrates together, but there's this left versus right brain, what's the word? A tendency for either the left brain or the right to be dominant, so that you can be in a left brain dominant personality state or a right brain dominant personality state. Just like you can be in a, say, trauma from my childhood dominant state, or a state where goal dominant state, that kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, I mean, similarly, if you're working on a fine motor activity, there are probably certain parts of your brain that are more active during that. Or if you're speaking, perhaps there are parts of the brain, more active during that time when you're not speaking. So, I mean, the brain's very modular, and these modules all work together. I don't see anything controversial about that. I think what's controversial to me is this idea that, well, we need to be more left brain focused or more right brain focused, or we need to pay more attention to the left side or the right side. And I don't. Maybe he's making a case for that. I've only gotten through the first 3 chapters of the book, so maybe there's more of that to come.
Well, I think this is kind of like what you were saying earlier. This book is more of an attempt to it might be a bit of an overcorrection in some ways. I mean, he's trying to point out a point, so he's not given an absolutely balanced perspective, because he's trying to point out that we tend to be very left brain in our society. I think from at the very beginning, maybe it's in chapter 2, but he does say, I don't want to give the impression that I don't think the left brain is useful, or that all the tools of logic and language are faulty somehow, but I just want to show that we have this entirely other perspective that we can demonstrate we are not as fluid at using, not as effective at using. And I think, I agree, it would be great to have follow-up books that show more how the left and right brain work together in tandem to produce more better results. I just don't think that's the point of the book. I would also like to see, as Juggling Lesson was suggesting, that there would be more practical applications of these ideas. And again, I think Vervaeke is the best person right now, at least, to point to for doing that.
And something I would like to see addressed, which maybe nobody knows, and I don't know if he's going to get into this in the book, but he mentions in the book that this lateralization has been around for a long time, like predates humans, perhaps predates mammals. It goes way back. How does something like this originate? We all have bilateral symmetry, and that's very ancient. And
right,
it seems very easy that if I look at the left side of my body and the right side of my body, for the most part, they're identical. You've got certain organs that are only in one or the other, but it's very easy. You just have I'm not sure how that works in development, how that bilateral symmetry develops. But the asymmetry, what is causing that, and what would cause something like that to evolve and to be preserved over generations?
Right. Well, and I think he talks about the pressures that our environment push on us to, on the one hand, be on the lookout for those resources we need to grasp and those dangers, friend or foes out there that exist. So I think the argument is that it was lateralized because we literally have to be doing two jobs most of the time, or at least prior to us making our nice cozy in society. If we were still cavemen out in the wild, we would, on the one hand, be having to constantly look out for the tiger that's trying to kill us. On the other hand, we have to be able to aim our bow and track our prey or gather our fruits and veggies or whatever. And so the argument is that those are two very different processes, that drilling down to the food that is my goal and spreading out to be aware of the prey that is hunting me are two very different processes, and they required completely different ways of thinking about the world.
My understanding of the situation is it's a lot more than two.
Yes.
And you can sort them together by what things you can do at the same time or what things require this or that. I can chew gum and sing and walk all at the same time. But there's some things that I have to not do those things to do the other thing. And that for me is a good way to come up with a list of what are these sub-agents that are in there. And part of this is my research into artificial intelligence, where we have managed, and I don't know if this is a good metaphor for how our brains work, but I don't know if it's actually biomimetic, but if I have an automated car, I have a separate layer that is looking for lanes. I have a separate layer that is looking for stoplights. I have a separate layer that is constantly scanning for pedestrians. And the end result is they're all looking at the same inputs independently, and they have an output that then goes to the conscious, heuristically defined part of the control, which is to say, if there is a pedestrian anywhere near coming into the path of the vehicle, immediately stop the vehicle. There's the rule. And that those agents are constantly running, and they're modal also. I shouldn't say they're constantly running. I'm not looking for food right now. I might be looking for some soda, but like that.
Yeah, I'd only say that from what I can tell, the way the right brain functions is not to be looking for a stop sign, a pedestrian, a danger, a safe place to be, but it's more that the way it's structured, because that's right brain, to look for the cross guard or the stop sign. That's very right brain focus. But when we're scanning, we have a gestalt of the whole viewpoint, and then things leap out to our attention, at which point our left brain can look at them and figure out what's going on. So the right brain is trying to scan and draw attention to points that seem interesting for good or ill. And there's these emotional ties that happens to that, like danger, and that's where you want to turn. Sure. And then the right brain goes, oh yes, that's the turn that I need to make next. That kind of thing. Yeah. Or left brain does. And what's the other thing that was making me think of? That's another dimension of this that he gets into is front to back brain processing. So it's not just the lateralization, it's front to back. It appears, however, that it may be more difficult for us to study the front to back than the left to the right. There seems to be, I don't know. I'm very, very interested to find out what where we can target thinking from front to back. What kind of thinking happens from front to back? I believe as we go towards the back, it's more our autonomic reactions. It's our the skills and habits, things we do without processing, without it's S1, if you will. And then if you there's this dynamic that goes S1,
System
S2,
1, System 2.
System 1, System 2.
The fast, I know it all, but I'm really quick and sloppy, versus I can go down through and every step of a syllogism.
Right. I believe that S1 is processing is further back in the brain and S2 is further forward. I was getting confused there for a while and thinking that was lateralized between the hemispheres, but I think it's front to back. I could be wrong. I'm trying to figure that out.
Right.
Certainly, I've heard people describe S1, and I've not been able to figure out, now, are they talking about left brain or right brain? And then they'll describe S2, and it's like, I'm still not sure if that's left brain or right brain. But it seems to me that it is those things that are more ingrained in habit and autonomic reactions versus those things that take more explicit thinking. And I think the left and right hemisphere can both do those explicit thinking processes. And we have another visual.
Yes, this would be the visual. In this case, I'm talking about the homunculus being this part of the brain here. Obviously the frontal lobe, and then this line where we have the body coming in. We have the input and the output, and so the two different homunculuses, and then you have the perceptual system. So I tend to think of the brain, at least in this part of it, as frontal, homunculus, perceptual. I don't know if that's a really good application, but it's just a map in my head.
Right. That is a very cool picture. That's interesting that it's right in the middle. Yeah. Well, it's the way our bodies map to our brain. In that context, there's another theory of homunculus that is more like, there's a person within our head, kind of like.
Yeah, that's where it came from. But what is Rene Descartes' little observer in there? And no, not that. Yeah. Well, the thing that I find interesting is that functionally, the frontal lobe is everything forward of that, and the perceptual is everything after that. On the top exterior. I'm not talking about down inside.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And that it's right in the middle. That almost becomes a point of lateralization from front to back, where you have the processes that are more self-aware. I don't know. I'll have to look up that image. Could you post that in the the book club notes? Because I would love to look at that.
Yep.
Well, how are we doing? This has been good. We seem to be just mainly hashing through the content of the book, as well as bringing up some frustrations we have at its lack of a applicability to our daily life. Do we have any other comments?
Oh, yeah, I had another thing that I wasn't sure I agreed with, and he's trying to make the case that music is the precursor to language.
Yes. You want to say more
so
about that?
I would think that if there's the precursors to language start with other species. We know that lots of other animals communicate. They communicate vocally. They have, like take wolves for example. They'd have different types of growls and barks and such. Now you could look at something like what we call bird song or whale's song, and you could, for a loose definition of music, call that music because you've got varying pitch and maybe a rhythm to it. But I would argue it's a form of vocal communication. And does the fact that you have vocal communication that involves pitch and rhythm make that music?
Well, I think what his argument is what makes it music is which hemisphere is doing the processing. There seems to be good reason to believe that when you're dealing with modulation of pitch and rhythm, that the right brain is doing most of the processing. And when you're doing, when you're speaking of specific meanings, then the left brain is doing the processing. So that once language gets into that, then you're actually doing more of the left brain processing. Now, I think I would agree that it seems to me that the left brain functionality of specific meanings, whether it's in gestures or in words, or perhaps even in tone, that, well, I don't know about tone actually, but those are, I think they co-evolved to produce the language we have now. I think one of his biggest points was that when animals and people are using musical-like structures, things that activate in the right hemisphere, that this has a lot to do with social connection, emotional connection, things that are less about what is that piece of fruit over there that I want to eat, and more about this is the environment I exist in. I exist within this community. I am connected to this community. That is more of a to use Reveki's, that is a being mode, not a having mode. That would be another distinction between the hemispheres, that you have the left brain having something and the right hemisphere being in a state, understanding what the entire gestalt of the situation was. And I think there's good reason to believe that music produces that being mode effect, whereas language, at least propositional language, not so much perhaps in poetry, has to do with the having mode. So I think I would agree with you to the degree that I'm not sure you can establish that it was for certain music that gave us language, but I would suggest that both had both left hemispheres and both processes were involved in developing what we know of as language now.
Do birds have music? Do birds have language?
Yeah, so I don't know.
I'm exploring definitions.
Okay.
I'm not so much asking you, do they actually? I'm more defining music and language in this case by saying,
sure. Is there music a form of language? And is there language in the form of music?
Yeah.
And I would say yes. I think we, the right brain would suggest we have to look at it that way. I think we would otherwise get stuck in trying to oversimplify the situation.
Well, if our lives were a musical or an opera, then I guess there would be no distinction really between communicating and singing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And which comes first, poetry or prose? I think he was mentioning that too in the book.
Yeah, I wasn't quite following that section. I should have reversed it, rewound it. Can you remember what he was talking about prose?
No, I'd have to find it.
Okay.
I'm thinking of the very first pieces of language. Probably the most important social pieces are like the calls that primates or meerkats make to identify specific threats. And so that's like the most basic language that I want to call social language.
Yeah.
And then that just takes over all mammals, and well, probably birds as well, have this audible communication. It takes over, and we stop being silent. We start making calls. We start communicating. I don't know if I'm saying anything important here.
No, I think that's context. And like I said, I don't know. It seems to me that both hemispheres are engaged in language and music. In fact, I think he talks about at one point that he talks about that when we listen to music, when the general population listens to music, it's generally the right brain that is engaged. But when a student of music is listening to music, the left brain is very engaged, and he theorizes that is because they have a layer of theory, of specific analysis that is being involved. And so when those individuals that have that theory training are listening to music, then they're not only processing the emotional layers of music, but they are also processing the specific structures that are involved. Well, guys, I got kids wanting my attention, and
Thank you.
yeah,
See you next week.
Yeah. Are we going to do another
Oh.
3 chapters for next week?
I think that's the goal.
Sure.
Is that right, Mark? Good.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. And if it's okay with you guys, I'd love to put this on my YouTube channel.
Oh,
I
that's
have no
fine.
objection.
I will make it available on my YouTube channel, and I guess you can probably mirror it. Is that right?
I don't know how that works. I'll have to figure it out.
Okay. Sounds good.
I know how to download YouTube videos. I've been doing some editing. So if you, and I have this, it's a web page based thing, and it's very spammy. So I need to warn you about, ignore all this stuff, but this part works.
The 15 shots of nearly nude people that will shock you.
Yes. Cute grills in your area.
Yes. All right, guys. Thank you. This was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. Talk to you next week.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Talk to you next week.
Bye.